The security camera at Millfield Elementary captured it all in grainy, time-stamped detail. At exactly 3:42 p.m. on November 8, 2012, 73-year-old Ruth Caldwell walked past the school's front gate, her silver hair catching the pale autumn sunlight. She moved with the careful but determined gait of someone who had walked this same route every day for 15 years, her small purse clutched against her navy cardigan, her mother's gold Seiko watch glinting on her thin wrist. The footage shows Ruth pausing at the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, checking her watch with the practiced motion of someone who lived by precise schedules. She glanced both ways, a habit ingrained from decades of teaching children about street safety, then stepped into the crosswalk. The timestamp reads 3:42:17 p.m. when she enters the frame. At 3:42:34 p.m., the camera captures an empty intersection. 17 seconds. That's all it took for Ruth Caldwell to vanish from the world, as completely as if she had never existed. For 12 years, that 17-second gap would haunt everyone who knew her. Police would analyze the footage frame by frame. Private investigators would walk the route countless times. Family members would replay those final moments until they could recite every detail from memory, but nothing, no witness, no evidence, no logical explanation, could account for how a 73-year-old woman simply evaporated in broad daylight on a busy street corner. Then, in March 2024, construction workers demolishing an abandoned Victorian house 47 miles away made a discovery that would shatter everything the Caldwell family thought they knew about Ruth's disappearance. Hidden beneath rotting floorboards in what had once been a bedroom, they found a small collection of personal items: reading glasses, a faded photograph, and a delicate gold Seiko watch. The watch that Ruth's family swore had stopped working weeks before her disappearance was not only intact, it was still ticking, keeping perfect time, as if it had been waiting 12 years for someone to find it. Ruth Caldwell was the kind of woman who made everyone around her feel like the world still had order. At 73, she possessed that increasingly rare quality of absolute reliability, the sort of person whose word was her bond, and whose schedule was as predictable as sunrise. Her small colonial house on Elm Street in Millfield had been her sanctuary for 48 years, first as a young bride, then as a mother of 3, and finally as a widow learning to navigate life alone. The house reflected Ruth's character: immaculate without being sterile, welcoming without being cluttered. Every morning she would sit at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the local newspaper, watching the sunrise paint her garden in shades of gold. The routine never varied: coffee at 6:30 a.m., breakfast at 7:15, morning chores completed by 10 SAU, lunch at noon, and then, at exactly 3:42 p.m., she would lace up her sensible walking shoes and embark on her daily constitutional around the neighborhood. The timing wasn't arbitrary. Ruth had once confided to her closest neighbor, Eleanor Patterson, that 3:42 p.m. was when her late husband Frank used to call her from his insurance office during their 47 years of marriage. "Just to hear your voice, Ruthie," he would say, his voice warm with the kind of love that deepens rather than fades with time. Even 5 years after Frank's death from pancreatic cancer, Ruth honored that moment by stepping out into the world, as if she were walking toward his memory. She always wore her mother's gold Seiko watch on these walks, a delicate timepiece that had been her most treasured inheritance. The watch had developed an annoying habit in recent months of stopping and starting unpredictably, sometimes losing hours, sometimes gaining them. Ruth had mentioned to several people that she needed to have it repaired, but somehow never found the time. It was one of those small procrastinations that would later take on enormous significance. Ruth's 3 adult children, Michael, a software engineer in Denver, Sarah, a pediatric nurse in Boston, and Jennifer, a high school principal who lived just 20 minutes away in neighboring Westbrook, had grown accustomed to their mother's unwavering schedule. They could set their own clocks by her habits. Ruth Caldwell was predictability personified, which made what happened on November 8, 2012, so utterly incomprehensible to everyone who knew her. The morning of November 8th began like thousands of others, but those who knew Ruth best would later recall subtle signs that something was different. Eleanor Patterson, who had shared morning coffee with Ruth twice a week for over a decade, noticed an unusual restlessness in her friend during their 9 a.m. visit. Ruth kept glancing at her problematic Seiko watch and tapping her fingers against her coffee cup, an uncharacteristic display of nervous energy that set Eleanor on edge. "She asked me the strangest question," Eleanor would later tell Detective Martinez during one of many interviews. "She wanted to know if I thought people could ever really escape their past. I laughed it off. Told her at our age, the past is all we've got." But Ruth didn't laugh. She just stared out the window at her garden and said, "Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, Eleanor. Sometimes it comes looking for you. And when it does, you have to decide who you really are." At 11:30 a.m., Ruth received a phone call that lasted exactly 7 minutes, a detail that would later prove significant when phone records were subpoenaed. Tom Bradley, who lived across the street and was working in his garage, noticed Ruth pacing in front of her living room window during the call, something he had never seen her do in the 15 years they had been neighbors. When the call ended, Ruth stood motionless for several minutes, staring at the phone as if it might ring again. The afternoon brought more unusual behavior. Ruth's mailman, Jerry Kowalski, who had been delivering to Elm Street for 8 years, later told investigators that Ruth was waiting for him at her mailbox, something she had never done before. She seemed anxious about a particular piece of mail, asking specifically if he had anything for her from out of state. When Jerry handed her the usual collection of bills and advertisements, Ruth's face fell with what he described as genuine disappointment, maybe even fear. At 2:30 p.m., Ruth made an unscheduled trip to First National Bank, where she withdrew $500 in cash, an unusual amount for someone who typically used her debit card for all purchases. Bank security footage shows her speaking briefly with teller Susan Morrison, who later recalled that Ruth seemed agitated and kept checking that old watch of hers. Ruth asked about safe deposit boxes, specifically how quickly someone could access one if they had the key. It was an odd question from a woman who had banked there for over 20 years and had never shown interest in safe deposit boxes before. The final piece of Ruth's increasingly strange day came at 3:15 p.m., just 27 minutes before her disappearance. Margaret Chen, who worked at Millfield Pharmacy, watched Ruth enter the store and head directly to the payphone near the entrance, an antiquated device that most people had forgotten existed. Margaret couldn't hear the conversation, but she observed Ruth feeding quarters into the machine and speaking in what appeared to be urgent, hushed tones. The call lasted less than 3 minutes, and when Ruth hung up, her hands were visibly shaking. At 3:38 p.m., Ruth left the pharmacy and began walking toward her usual route. Margaret Chen was the last person to see Ruth Caldwell alive, and she would never forget the expression on the older woman's face, a mixture of determination and terror that suggested Ruth was walking towards something she both dreaded and felt compelled to face. Jennifer Caldwell's first indication that something was wrong came at 6:15 p.m., when she called her mother's house for their usual evening check-in and got no answer. This was unprecedented. In the 5 years since Frank's death, Ruth had never missed one of these calls. Jennifer tried again at 6:30, then 6:45, each unanswered ring amplifying her growing anxiety. By 7 p.m., Jennifer was in her car, driving the familiar 20-minute route to her mother's house. She found Ruth's front door locked, which was normal. But when she used her spare key to enter, the house felt wrong in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. Everything was in its proper place. Ruth's coffee cup washed and put away, her bed made with military precision, her purse absent from its usual spot on the kitchen counter. But there was an underlying tension in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Jennifer called Eleanor Patterson, who confirmed that Ruth had left for her walk at exactly 3:42 p.m., as always. Eleanor had been watering her plants and had waved goodbye, receiving Ruth's customary smile and wave in return. Nothing had seemed amiss. But when Jennifer checked Ruth's bedroom, she made a discovery that sent ice through her veins. Ruth's nightgown was laid out on the bed, her slippers positioned precisely beside it, as if she had been preparing for a normal evening at home. The call to 911 came at 8:23 p.m. Jennifer's voice, captured on the emergency recording, betrayed a daughter's worst fears. "My mother is missing. She's 73 years old, and she never deviates from her routine. Something terrible has happened. The dispatcher, trained to handle missing person reports with measured calm, noted the urgency in Jennifer's voice and the unusual circumstances. An elderly woman with no history of confusion or wandering vanished during her daily walk in broad daylight. Eleanor Patterson joined Jennifer at Ruth's house within minutes of the 911 call, bringing with her the kind of practical concern that comes from decades of friendship. Together, they conducted a thorough search of the house, looking for any clue that might explain Ruth's absence. They found her medications in their usual place, her reading glasses on the nightstand, her car keys hanging on their designated hook. Most puzzling was the discovery of Ruth's emergency contact list, written in her careful handwriting, placed prominently on the kitchen table, as if she had wanted someone to find it. The two women sat in Ruth's living room as darkness fell, surrounded by the familiar objects of a life lived with purpose and care. Family photographs smiled down from the mantelpiece, Frank's reading chair still positioned at the perfect angle to catch the afternoon light, Ruth's knitting basket beside her favorite spot on the sofa. Everything spoke of a woman who expected to return home, who had no intention of disappearing forever. Yet Ruth Caldwell was gone, and with each passing hour, the certainty that something terrible had happened grew stronger. Detective Ray Martinez arrived at Ruth's house at 9:47 p.m., bringing with him 23 years of experience in missing persons cases and a reputation for thoroughness that had earned him the respect of both colleagues and families in crisis. He found Jennifer and Eleanor in the living room, clutching cups of tea that had long since gone cold, their faces etched with the particular anguish that comes from waiting for news that might never come. Martinez's initial assessment was methodical and comprehensive. He walked Ruth's usual route 3 times, using a high-powered flashlight to examine every bush, every storm drain, every potential hiding place where an elderly woman might have fallen or sought shelter. The route was straightforward. Down Elm Street to Maple Avenue, left on Maple to 3rd Street, right on 3rd to Oak Boulevard, then a loop back through Riverside Park to Elm Street. Total distance, 1.7 miles. Total time, approximately 45 minutes. Ruth had been making this same walk for 15 years without incident. The security footage from Millfield Elementary became the focal point of the investigation. Martinez spent hours analyzing the grainy images, consulting with the school's IT director to enhance the video quality and examine every frame. The footage clearly showed Ruth approaching the intersection of Maple and 3rd at 3:42:17 p.m. She paused, checked her watch, looked both ways, and stepped into the crosswalk. At 3:42:34 p.m., the intersection was empty. 17 seconds of missing time that defied explanation. Martinez expanded the search to include footage from nearby businesses, traffic cameras, and residential security systems. The investigation revealed a troubling pattern. Ruth appeared on multiple cameras along her route until she reached that specific intersection, then vanished completely. No camera in a 6-block radius captured her after 3:42:34 p.m. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist at that precise moment and location. The physical search intensified over the following days. Millfield Police Department, assisted by volunteers from the community and search and rescue teams from 3 neighboring counties, combed through every inch of the area. They searched abandoned buildings, wooded areas, construction sites, and even the town's small river, dragging sections where the current might have carried a body. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the surrounding countryside. Search dogs followed Ruth's scent to the intersection where she vanished, then lost the trail completely. Interviews with potential witnesses yielded frustratingly little information. Several people remembered seeing Ruth on her walk that day: the postal worker who waved to her on Elm Street, a jogger who passed her near the park entrance, a mother pushing a stroller who smiled at Ruth's friendly greeting. But no one saw her after she entered that crosswalk. It was as if Ruth Caldwell had walked into an invisible void and been swallowed whole. The investigation expanded to include Ruth's personal life, financial records, and medical history. Detective Martinez discovered the unusual bank withdrawal and the mysterious phone calls. But these clues only deepened the mystery. Ruth's bank account showed no other unusual activity. Her medical records revealed a woman in good health for her age, with no history of dementia, depression, or any condition that might explain a sudden disappearance. Her phone records showed the incoming call at 11:30 a.m. from a number that traced to a payphone in Hartford, Connecticut, a city where Ruth had no known connections. As days turned into weeks, the case began to take on the characteristics that Martinez dreaded most. A missing person investigation with no logical explanation, no clear leads, and no satisfying resolution in sight. Ruth Caldwell had become one of those cases that would haunt him for years to come, a reminder that sometimes people simply vanish, leaving behind only questions and the terrible weight of not knowing. 12 years, 4 months, and 16 days after Ruth Caldwell walked into that intersection and disappeared, construction worker Miguel Santos was demolishing the interior of a Victorian house at 247 Sycamore Street in Brookhaven, a small town 47 miles from Millfield. The house had been abandoned for over a decade, its windows boarded up, its yard overgrown with weeds and wild vines that had claimed the structure as their own. Miguel was working alone that Tuesday morning in March 2024, using a crowbar to pry up the rotting floorboards in what had once been a bedroom on the second floor. The work was routine. He had demolished dozens of similar houses over his 15-year career in construction. But when he lifted a particularly stubborn section of flooring near the room's single window, he discovered something that made him stop cold. Hidden in the space between the floorboards and the subflooring was a small collection of items wrapped in what appeared to be a plastic shopping bag. The bag had protected its contents from moisture and decay, preserving them in an almost pristine condition that seemed impossible given the house's state of deterioration. Miguel's first instinct was to call his supervisor, but curiosity got the better of him. He carefully extracted the package and opened it with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering ancient artifacts. Inside the bag were 3 items: a pair of reading glasses with delicate gold frames, a black and white photograph of a young couple standing in front of a church, and a woman's wristwatch. The watch was the most striking of the 3, a delicate gold Seiko with an intricate face and a thin leather band that showed signs of regular wear. Miguel held it up to his ear and heard something that made his blood run cold. The steady rhythmic ticking of a timepiece that was very much alive. The photograph showed a man in a military uniform and a young woman in a simple white dress, their faces radiant with the kind of joy that comes from believing the future holds nothing but happiness. On the back, written in fading blue ink, were the words, "Frank and Ruth, June 15th, 1962, our beginning." The reading glasses were clearly designed for a woman, with small rhinestones embedded in the frames, the kind of modest decoration that suggested someone who wanted to feel pretty while remaining practical. But it was the watch that truly defied explanation. Miguel examined it closely, noting the inscription on the back. "To my darling Ruth, love always, Mother, 1960. The timepiece showed the correct time, 10:47 a.m., matching Miguel's phone exactly. This was impossible. The house had been abandoned since 2010, with no electricity, no heat, and no human presence. Yet here was a mechanical watch that had somehow continued running for over a decade in a hidden space beneath rotting floorboards. Miguel immediately called the police, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what he had found. Within an hour, Brookhaven Police Detective Lisa Chen was standing in the abandoned bedroom, staring at the items that would reopen one of the region's most baffling missing person cases. Detective Chen had heard of Ruth Caldwell's disappearance. It was the kind of case that law enforcement officers discussed at conferences and training sessions, a perfect example of how someone could simply vanish without a trace. The discovery at 247 Sycamore Street would prove to be the key that unlocked 12 years of mystery. But it would also raise new questions that were even more disturbing than Ruth's original disappearance. Because the house where these items were found had a history that connected to Ruth Caldwell in ways that no one could have imagined. A connection that would reveal the dark secret Ruth had been carrying for decades and the terrible choice she had made on that November afternoon in 2012. The revelation came through a routine property record search that Detective Chen conducted as part of her investigation into the Sycamore Street house. What she discovered in the dusty files of the Brookhaven County Clerk's office would fundamentally alter everything law enforcement thought they knew about Ruth Caldwell's disappearance and the woman herself. 247 Sycamore Street had been purchased in 1987 by one Robert Eugene Caldwell, Frank Caldwell's younger brother, a man whose existence Ruth had never mentioned to her children, her neighbors, or apparently anyone else in her life. The property records revealed a complex web of ownership transfers, mortgage defaults, and legal disputes that painted a picture of a man whose life had been marked by financial instability and legal troubles. Detective Chen's deeper investigation into Robert Caldwell revealed a criminal history that made her stomach turn. In 1991, he had been arrested for aggravated assault against his then-girlfriend. In 1995, charges of domestic violence were filed and later dropped when the victim refused to testify. In 1998, he was convicted of fraud and served 18 months in state prison. The pattern was clear. Robert Caldwell was a dangerous man with a history of violence against women and a complete disregard for the law. But the most shocking discovery came when Detective Chen cross-referenced Robert's criminal history with missing person reports from the 1990s and early 2000s. 3 women who had been romantically involved with Robert Caldwell had disappeared over a span of 15 years. All 3 cases had gone cold. All 3 women had last been seen in the vicinity of Brookhaven, and all 3 had been found, years later, buried in remote locations around the county. The connection between Ruth and Robert became clearer when Detective Chen obtained Frank Caldwell's military records and family history. Robert was Frank's younger brother by 8 years, a man who had been estranged from the family since the early 1980s, following a series of increasingly violent incidents. Frank had obtained a restraining order against Robert in 1983, after Robert had threatened Ruth during a family gathering. The restraining order had been renewed multiple times over the years, but it had expired in 2010, 2 years before Ruth's disappearance. Detective Chen's investigation revealed that Robert had been contacting Ruth in the months leading up to her disappearance. Phone records showed multiple calls from payphones in Hartford, Connecticut, where Robert had been living in a halfway house after his release from his most recent prison sentence. The calls had started in September 2012 and increased in frequency as November approached. Ruth had never reported these calls to police, never told her children about them, never sought help despite the obvious distress they were causing her. The truth that emerged was both heartbreaking and terrifying. Ruth had been living in fear for months, knowing that Robert was out of prison and trying to contact her. The restraining order had expired, and Robert had made it clear in his calls that he blamed Ruth for his estrangement from Frank and the family. He had demanded money, threatened to reveal family secrets that could destroy Ruth's carefully constructed life, and finally demanded that she meet him at the abandoned house in Brookhaven. The phone call Ruth received on the morning of November 8th had been Robert's ultimatum: meet him at 4 p.m. at 247 Sycamore Street, or he would come to Millfield and make her life a living hell. Ruth, terrified for her own safety and desperate to protect her children from the truth about their uncle, had made the decision to face Robert alone. She had withdrawn the cash he demanded, made her final preparations, and walked to that intersection knowing she might never return home. The security footage that showed Ruth disappearing at the intersection had captured only part of the story. What it hadn't shown was Robert Caldwell waiting in a stolen car just out of camera range, ready to take his sister-in-law to a confrontation that would end in tragedy. Ruth Caldwell hadn't vanished into thin air. She had been taken by a predator who had been stalking her for months, a man whose violence had finally claimed the life of someone who had spent decades trying to forget he existed. The final pieces of Ruth Caldwell's story came together through a combination of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Robert Caldwell's own confession, a rambling, self-serving account that revealed the depths of his depravity and the courage Ruth had shown in her final hours. Robert was arrested at a homeless shelter in Springfield, Massachusetts, on March 28, 2024, 3 days after the discovery at Sycamore Street. At 68, he was a broken man whose years of alcohol abuse and violence had left him physically frail, but still capable of the manipulation and cruelty that had defined his entire adult life. When confronted with the evidence linking him to Ruth's disappearance, he initially denied everything, claiming he hadn't seen his sister-in-law in decades. But the evidence was overwhelming. DNA analysis of the items found beneath the floorboards confirmed they belonged to Ruth. More damning was the discovery of Ruth's remains in the basement of 247 Sycamore Street, buried beneath a concrete slab that Robert had poured in late November 2012. The medical examiner determined that Ruth had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. Robert's confession, given in exchange for a plea agreement that would spare him the death penalty, revealed the horrific details of Ruth's final day. He had indeed been calling her for months, demanding money and threatening to reveal that Frank had known about Robert's criminal history, but had never told Ruth the full extent of his brother's violence. Robert claimed that Frank had been sending him money for years to keep him away from the family, a lie designed to make Ruth feel guilty and compliant. On November 8th, Robert had driven a stolen car to Millfield and waited near the intersection where he knew Ruth would pass during her daily walk. When she approached, he had forced her into the car at gunpoint, then driven her to the abandoned house in Brookhaven. His plan, he claimed, had been to take the money and let her go. But Ruth had fought back with a ferocity that surprised him. According to Robert's confession, Ruth had refused to give him the money, telling him that she would rather die than let him continue to terrorize her family. She had called him a coward and a failure, comparing him unfavorably to Frank in ways that enraged him. The confrontation had escalated quickly, ending when Robert struck Ruth with a piece of concrete debris from the house's crumbling foundation. But Robert's confession contained one detail that investigators initially dismissed as another of his lies. Ruth's watch had stopped working during the struggle, its delicate mechanism damaged when she fell. Robert claimed he had tried to restart it, obsessively winding it and shaking it as Ruth lay dying, as if keeping time could somehow undo what he had done. When the watch finally began ticking again, he had taken it as a sign that he needed to hide the evidence of his crime. The forensic analysis of the watch revealed something extraordinary. The timepiece had indeed been damaged during the struggle, but it had been repaired, not by a professional, but by someone with basic mechanical knowledge who had carefully cleaned and adjusted its internal mechanisms. Robert had spent hours working on the watch, his confession revealed, driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain. He had hidden it with Ruth's other belongings, checking on it periodically over the years to ensure it was still running. The psychological evaluation of Robert Caldwell painted a picture of a man whose entire life had been defined by his inability to accept responsibility for his actions. He blamed Frank for his estrangement from the family, blamed his victims for his violence, and even blamed Ruth for her own death. But his obsession with keeping her watch running suggested a level of guilt and remorse that he was incapable of expressing in any other way. The news of Robert Caldwell's arrest and confession reached Ruth's family on a gray April morning that seemed to mirror the weight of the revelations they were about to receive. Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah gathered in Detective Martinez's office, the same man who had investigated their mother's disappearance 12 years earlier and had never stopped believing that answers would eventually come. The truth about their mother's final months was devastating. Ruth had been living in terror, facing threats from a man they had never known existed, carrying the burden of protecting them from a family secret that had ultimately cost her life. The children struggled to reconcile this image of their mother as a victim with their memories of her as a pillar of strength and stability. Jennifer was the first to speak after Detective Martinez finished explaining the evidence. "She never told us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She faced this alone because she was trying to protect us." The realization that Ruth had walked to her death knowing the danger she faced, choosing to confront Robert rather than involve her children, was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Michael, the engineer who had always approached problems with logic and systematic thinking, struggled with the randomness of his mother's fate. "All these years, we thought she might have had a stroke, or gotten confused, or fallen somewhere. We never imagined." He couldn't finish the sentence, but his siblings understood. They had never imagined that their mother's disappearance was the result of a predator who had been stalking her, a family member whose existence had been hidden from them their entire lives. Sarah, whose work as a pediatric nurse had exposed her to the worst of human nature, found herself angry at their father for keeping Robert's existence secret. "Dad knew," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "He knew what Robert was capable of, and he never warned us. Mom died because she didn't know how dangerous he really was." The family's grief was complicated by the discovery of Ruth's final preparations. Detective Martinez showed them the emergency contact list Ruth had left on her kitchen table, the careful way she had laid out her nightgown, the small note she had hidden in her jewelry box that simply said, "I love you all. Be happy." Ruth had known she might not return from her confrontation with Robert, and she had tried to make her absence as easy as possible for her children to bear. The community of Millfield rallied around the Caldwell family with the same support they had shown during the initial search 12 years earlier. Eleanor Patterson, now 85 and frail, spoke at a memorial service held at the elementary school where Ruth's final moments had been captured on camera. "Ruth was the bravest person I ever knew," Eleanor said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. "She faced evil to protect the people she loved, and that's how we should remember her." The memorial service became a celebration of Ruth's life, rather than a mourning of her death. Neighbors shared stories of her kindness. Former students from her teaching days spoke about her influence on their lives, and her children read from letters Ruth had written to them over the years. Letters filled with love, wisdom, and the kind of maternal guidance that transcends death. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Jennifer announced the family's decision to donate Ruth's house to a local organization that provided safe housing for women escaping domestic violence. "Mom spent her last months living in fear," Jennifer said. "We want her home to be a place where other women can find safety and hope." Robert Eugene Caldwell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on a cold December morning in 2024. He showed no emotion as the judge read the sentence, no acknowledgement of the lives he had destroyed or the family he had torn apart. But as he was led away in shackles, he made one final request that would haunt everyone who heard it. He asked to keep Ruth's watch. The request was denied, of course. The gold Seiko was returned to Ruth's children, who decided to have it professionally restored and displayed in a place of honor in Jennifer's home. But the watchmaker who examined the timepiece made a discovery that no one could explain. The internal mechanisms showed signs of recent maintenance, careful adjustments that could only have been made by someone with intimate knowledge of vintage watch repair. Robert Caldwell had no such knowledge. His criminal history showed no evidence of mechanical aptitude or interest in timepieces. Yet someone had been maintaining Ruth's watch during the 12 years it spent hidden beneath those floorboards, keeping it running with a precision that defied explanation. The watchmaker, a third-generation craftsman named David Chen, examined every component of the Seiko under magnification. "This watch has been serviced regularly," he told Jennifer. "The oil is fresh. The springs have been adjusted. Even the crystal has been polished. Someone has been taking care of this timepiece with the kind of attention you'd give to a family heirloom." Detective Martinez reopened the investigation briefly, wondering if Robert had had an accomplice, someone who had been visiting the abandoned house over the years to maintain the watch. But security footage from nearby businesses, interviews with neighbors, and a thorough examination of the property revealed no evidence of regular visitors. The house had been truly abandoned, left to decay while Ruth's watch continued its steady measurement of time. The mystery deepened when Jennifer discovered something else among her mother's belongings. A receipt from a watch repair shop in Hartford, Connecticut, dated just 2 weeks before Ruth's disappearance. The receipt showed that Ruth had taken her mother's Seiko to be serviced, specifically requesting that it be adjusted to keep perfect time. The watchmaker's notes indicated that Ruth had seemed anxious about the repair, asking repeatedly when the watch would be ready and whether it would continue running even under adverse conditions. Ruth had known she was walking into danger, and she had wanted her mother's watch to keep running no matter what happened to her. But how had it continued to receive maintenance during the 12 years it spent hidden in an abandoned house? Who had been caring for this delicate timepiece with such devotion and skill? The answer, if there is one, remains locked away with the other secrets that Ruth Caldwell carried to her grave. But sometimes, late at night, Jennifer swears she can hear the watch ticking from its place on her mantelpiece. Not the steady rhythm of a mechanical timepiece, but something more complex, more purposeful, as if time itself is trying to tell her something. as if some mysteries are meant to keep ticking forever, measuring moments that exist beyond our understanding of life and death. Ruth Caldwell's watch still keeps perfect time, marking the seconds and minutes and hours of a world that continues to turn without her. And somewhere in the space between the tick and the tock, between the known and the unknowable, her story continues. A reminder that love transcends death, that courage echoes through time, and that some questions are more important than their answers.